Welcome back, friends, to the Regeneration Podcast. Michael Martin here with my friend and my confidant, Mike Sauter. How's it going, bro?
Good. Broadcasting, talking to you from a location different from, I think I've only broadcasted outside my home, which is my upstairs old girls, my daughter's bedroom, twice. One, we were at my wife's brother in the Catskills, and I'm at my son's house near Columbus, Ohio, in his basement, and having a lovely time. It's a little bit warmer here. Spring is advanced from upstate New York to Columbus, Ohio. It's not blooming here, but it's more than I would think. I think it's about 3 weeks ahead of where we are just south of
Really?
Lake
Okay.
Ontario. Yep, yep.
Well, it's cold here today. It's been
Mhm.
cold the last few days, but the maple sap started to run finally,
Like crazy, didn't it?
like crazy,
I was
and
thinking this is going to be a very voluminous year. I was getting
it's hard
gallons
to
just from one
tell.
tree. Okay.
Now in Michigan, it's supposed to hit in the 60s on Tuesday,
Yeah.
Wednesday. And who knows what that's going to do to the sap flow, but I already, yeah, I mean, it's going to be a lot, and I'm probably going to boil this week.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so it's been
When
that kind
people drink the water, it's somewhat trendy, and now it's about what you need 35 gallons or 19 gallons of the maple water to get a gallon of sap or a
of,
quart
oh
of
no,
what's the
yeah,
percentage?
no, more than that.
Okay, yeah.
Depends on the kind of maple tree.
So we
So,
don't get enough, so we just drink the water and it's kind of trendy now, but I don't know, is there a claim made for that water? Do you drink the
I
water
heard
as well? Yeah,
I do. I mean, I don't
that's
drink a
really
lot
good.
of it,
Yeah. Just
but I
naturally
am.
sweet.
So so far I have 20 gallons. And last year,
How many trees do you have
that 20
tapped?
gallons, I bet I got a half a gallon of syrup
Okay.
because we don't have a lot of sugar maples. We have mostly silver maples and Norway maples.
Gotcha. Yeah, right, right, right.
Um, but yeah, whatever. It still works. Um, so that's what I've been doing. But today we're not here to talk about maple syrup, but we're here to talk about something sweet because we're welcoming back to the program Martin Nowak.
Hello, it's
Yes,
great
sir.
to be here. Great to be with
And
you.
Martin's cosmic vision can welcome in even tree sap for sure.
Yeah,
I think it's very inclusive. It's a
it's
broad
very
vision. Yeah,
Sophiatic for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
And now here's the thing, right? So last time we had Martin on the program, we were talking about his book Beyond, which when I think I told the story before when John Reese, my publisher, sent it to me to see what I thought. I was blown away. I said, "You got to publish this as soon as possible." And then uh maybe it was in the summer, maybe in the fall, John sent me another book by Martin of I don't know if I'd call it poetry, is more as poetic something or other investigation. It's very beautiful the way you write, and it's so different from everything out there. And this one's called Within. And there I was, as you know, Mike, I've published two books of poetry, but in the last 10 years. And here's Martin, who's not a professional poet as much as he is a scientist and mathematician. And I said, wow, he can put out two books of poetry in a year. I'm going to write a book on science. And
Wow.
and here's actual science and math is what I'm going to write. And here is I have
Okay.
the working draft of it. It's called I got a B plus in math, which will probably be from Angelico Press.
Good for you.
No, I'm kidding. So Martin is here today to talk about Within, and like Beyond, it's an extraordinary work. And again, when John sent it to me, again I was blown away. Um, Martin, I wonder if you could describe the book a little bit to us, and
Yes.
its maybe its relationship to Beyond.
So I have it.
Oh, can't see it.
We can't see it because
You've
it's
got the blur function. Yeah,
Yeah.
put your face behind it. Put your
Oh,
face
there you
behind.
go.
Yeah, I think we can see. Huh,
We can see Jesus. Jesus
there
is
it is. That's a pretty good one. Yeah.
there. It is.
yes, it's
Beautiful cover.
uh,
Beautiful cover. Yeah.
so it's Angelico Press, and this is of course a Fra Angelico fresco of the convent of San Marco in Florence, and it's the famous Noli me tangere, touch me not, for I
Mhm.
have not risen to the Father. And I'm very glad about this front cover. It has something to do with the book. but somehow, to begin at the beginning, it took me many years to work on those books because actually I started to work on Beyond in March 2019. It was published then in April 2024. But when I was done with Beyond, there was this complete empty space inside me. I didn't really know how to continue. I had to work on something like this again because the work on the book had become for me a prayer. And I didn't want to live anymore without this kind of prayer. So
Uh-huh.
there was this kind of necessity to work on something else. And I started to work on Within maybe more than 3 years ago or so. So I also worked on it. So over the time, and I worked sometimes on Beyond, sometimes on Within. And Within really was the encounter indirectly, but it was the encounter with Therese of Lisieux.
Mm.
Oh yeah.
The
And,
little flower. Yeah.
and so both books actually owe very much to Michael Martin, who has read them and commented them. And he gave me amazing comments to modify both books, but especially in Within, he had a brilliant comment about the fundamental structure because there was this Katha Upanishad. The Katha Upanishad was the first thing that I read that moved me toward writing Within. But then I didn't know where to place it in the book. And I had it pretty much in the beginning, but there it confused everybody. And Michael said it has to be in the middle. And now it's in the middle, and I think it's perfectly placed.
Very good. Well, thanks. Speaking of Teresa of Lisieux, I have a little story, but I bet our listeners would like. So, not intentionally, we named my oldest daughter after Saint Therese. Her name is May Teresa Martin. And we named her after my Aunt May, my Irish Aunt May, but also Teresa of Avila, which where she got her middle name. And we didn't find out till years later that Saint Therese, little flower, her full name was Marie Therese Martin.
Mm.
So we're kind of blown away. And when she was a baby, maybe a year old, there was the relics of Saint Therese were on tour on the United States for the first time, and right down the street from where we used to live was, or it still is, the Shrine of the Little Flower in Berkeley, Michigan, which is this beautiful church dedicated to Saint Therese. And at the time, I was a Waldorf teacher, and I really wanted to see the relics before I went to school, and they were coming in at like 4 in the morning. And I just didn't know if I'd be able to get up in time because as a teacher, you're always exhausted. Didn't know if he'd be able to get up in time to go to see the relics. But I thought, okay, I'll set the alarm. If it happens, it happens. And I'm not kidding. I had a dream that night or that early morning that Saint Therese comes into my dream and she says, "Réveille-toi." She says, "Wake up," in French. And I woke up and it was 4:45. And I said, "Oh." So I jump up, get my clothes on, jump in my truck, and I drive down to the church, which is about 2 miles away. And even I was still a mile away, and every parking spot was taken already. I was like, I'll never get in here. This is crazy. So I turned the corner at the church. There's a parking spot right there, right in front. So I parked. And I go in, and just as I go in, they're taking the relics right in front of me. And I was like, whoa, I'm supposed to be here for some reason. And but then, it was really a moving experience. I don't know why it was so moving, but it was extraordinary. And a few years later, my wife and I went to mass there, and we took the kids and my son Tommy, who's now he's a scientist. He's gonna be 30 this year. He'll be 30 next month or this month. And so he was probably 6 or 7. And we go in there, and in the narthex of the church, they have like the history of the church and all this, pictures and what have you, founding of the church. And they had a little section on the founding of the church where the visit of the relics of Saint Therese. And I wasn't looking at it. I was like looking around other stuff. And my son says, "Hey, Dad, look, there's a picture of you." And I'll be darned if there wasn't a photograph of when they were taking the relics right in front of when I was standing right there, right when I got into the church and the relics were going around in front, there was a photograph and I was in the middle of the photograph. So Saint Therese is very special to our family.
That's very
And
moving.
actually my second daughter, her name is Zélie, named after Saint Therese's mother. So Martin, talk about how this inspiration of Saint Therese worked in the unfolding of this book.
Yes, before I go there, can I ask you one thing? You say in your dream, she said this. Do you remember what she wore in your dream?
I don't remember. I
Yes.
remember her face. That's all I remember.
You remember the face? And the face is the face of the pictures.
I can't recall for sure, but I know it was her.
Yeah, interesting.
That's the
Well, she
great
was
part of a
speaking
dream.
French.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in any case, I read this Katha Upanishad. I was very moved by it, and I knew I had to use this in a book because it's a very deep discussion where actually a little boy or a boy or a young man visits the Lord of Death, and because his father had sent him there. So in my story, it is now a female because it's all sort of tied in with the female main character. But from the Lord of Death, he learns somehow the structure of the universe. He learns the secrets of Atman and of Brahman. And there is somehow the important sentence in there. Uh, the personal soul will become one with the soul of the universe. So the Atman will become one with the Brahman. And so I was moved by this idea. So our soul will become one with God. And I asked my mentor in theology, Sarah Coakley, if in Christianity we have similar visions. And then she said, actually, we describe it somewhat differently. We talk about this beatific vision of God. It's not that we become one with God, but sort of we are very close. However, she says, mystics often talk about becoming one with God.
Hmm.
I should read Teresa of Avila. So immediately taking Sarah Coakley's advice, I ordered Teresa of Avila, the interior castle, and I read it. And I read it with great fascination. And I'm very moved by it somehow that I can read directly the words of such a great saint and doctor of the church. Uh, and this interior castle has this is transparent castle. It has 7 stages. So within also has 7 movements, actually. Somehow that was a coincidence. I didn't even realize. Somebody pointed it out to me. But then I'm done with Teresa of Avila, very moved. And I said to myself, all my life, I knew there is what we call the great Therese and the little Therese.
Hmm.
And all my life, almost deliberately, I never wanted to hear anything about the little Therese. I have almost kind of blocked her out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
People do that.
I don't understand why, and now I thought I should at least figure out what she has done. And so then I start to read about her. And then I order the story of a soul. And then immediately I'm completely captivated. I'm completely captivated. I order every book about her I can find. I listen to the story of a soul not once, not twice, but 4 times. I have several editions of the story of a soul. I bought her letters. I have read all of her letters, 266 letters, multiple times. She
Wow.
became this power in my life, unbelievably moving. And also for the first time, I've never done anything like this before. I printed out a photograph of her and I hang it on the wall. And so then she was this presence of my life. And what happened to me has happened to tens of thousands of people before, that after encountering her, often by coincidence, they have this feeling she is with them. So then you have this feeling she's always there by your side as this kind
Wow.
of force. And but also she plays little jokes on you. She has this sense of humor. And I have also experienced this. But in any case, then I realized so that woman that I had in my book Beyond, who is this woman? I asked myself. And then I meet Therese, and somehow I felt there is this heavenly version of Therese that is actually that woman. So in Within, Therese of Lisieux, and that woman that is the main character of Within and also of Beyond kind of merge.
It's wild. Having you hear that, that was riveting for me because I remember the first time we spoke, and you're going to have to mention your background again for people who might not have listened.
Hmm.
The and before this broadcast this morning, Martin, I was thinking of how, so you're a scientist, but that first time, your Sophia figure, your wisdom figure in Beyond, um, it was I mean, it showed a familiarity. You're a very good writer. Um, the fact when you described how you saw that what you were writing was kind of poetry, that's all very moving too. But for me, I've, on and off, I sense a wisdom figure like you're describing needed in the US. And I see some resonances actually when I read Frank Baum's novel, Dorothy, the Wizard of Oz. There's kind of a playfulness, but you captured something. So hearing that you found that in Teresa and they've kind of merged, because I was saying, how does this guy, Martin, write so beautifully, deftly about the divine feminine? They're ethereal, but they're real. There's a singular gift you have for writing about her and choosing the words. But to think that you had that first one, then you read Therese and you're admitting that they're just kind of mingled in your mind and she becomes a presence. This is all very, very profound. It's fun to listen to. Thank you for that. Yeah.
I have this memory that I was running over this playfield. I don't know if I mentioned it last time in my childhood.
Mm,
Suddenly I was overwhelmed with this bliss of what I would call devotion. Devotion to something divine, feminine, would be infinite peace.
mm,
It was this very brief vision that I had there, and I kept running. It was nothing, but it's in my memory. And so somehow this idea was in me very early on. It came back later. There was always this idea of devotion to something that is divine, but also female in a sense. There's this
mm,
divine feminine. And now after meeting Therese, I have this feeling this was always her.
yeah.
It was always her, but I was not worthy to really get to know her. The time was not ripe.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
then came a moment in my life where finally she showed herself to me. And that's what I find so moving. So
Yeah.
before this, I was not ready. But then after experiencing a kind of suffering, I was then ready in a sense.
Wow.
I'm intrigued. I mean,
Me
these are
too.
beautiful stories, but these are beautiful stories you don't usually hear from scientists.
Yeah.
So, so I wonder if you could describe how your scientific self comports with this intuitive self.
Yeah, I also describe this in the book Within, so I'm always so in Within I actually argue that mathematics is something that brings us to God. I argue that evolution is something that brings us to God. So let us stay with mathematics, with the argument for mathematics for some time. So I'm a scientist, but I study how mathematics governs biological processes. And then we are in a world where many people are sort of not necessarily spiritual, they're very much materialistic, you could say. They would say the material world is everything there is, and it's the only thing that is really interesting. And the only thing that is interesting is science, and science will give us all the answers eventually. You could say this is a kind of a worldview. This is a kind of a worldview that I would often find among people at Harvard around me, among my colleagues or so. It goes without saying, nobody else can doubt that. And then to those people, I would actually say, if that's your perspective, so your perspective is science gives us all the answers, science will eventually teach us everything. What do you do with mathematics?
Mm,
Because mathematics is not a consequence of science. So once a mathematician proves a theorem, a truth has been stated that is independent of a scientific experiment. So it is not that science explains what is true and what is false in mathematics. That's quite independent of anything that physics or biology does. On the other hand, the best possible science is totally dependent on mathematics. So mathematical truth is in this world of unchanging eternal reality, immaterial. And this eternal unchanging truth is govern the material world, the changing world. And so for me, that's a step to the divine. Another word
mm.
for an unchanging eternal truth is the divine. So mathematics governs the world in a divine way.
Yeah, and it is bizarre. I mean, even when I taught mathematics to middle school, I would tell them it's kind of mysticism. Because it doesn't exist in nature. Where is science? Where is mathematics? Go out and find mathematics. You can't discover mathematics as a thing you're in the it's a platonic realm almost, right?
Yes, that's right. So that's very much described in within this worldview of mathematical Platonism or realism. So mathematics is mathematical objects exist, but they're not in the material world. They're not in the brain of people, but they do exist. And so the interesting thing is mathematicians themselves, they are pretty unsure about which philosophical position they should adopt. You know, many of them actually don't think about the philosophy of mathematics. But if you ask them the following question, you know, ask them, your great publications, for example, in those publications, have you invented something? Have you invented a truth, or have you discovered a truth? So, I mean, it's obvious that everybody says, I have discovered a truth. I have found something which is true, and this thing that is true, it was true before I found it. Even if I would have not found it, somebody else could have found it, and it's true. So mathematics, the experience is one of discovering a truth.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's why I used to love teaching math in middle school because you kind of get the kids right at that moment where they're looking for something. They kind of have the Irish educator Kieran Egan calls it romantic understanding, where kids are interested in the limits, and the great achievements of the world, but also in mystery. And for a lot of kids, now this didn't happen to me the way I was taught mathematics. It turned me off because it didn't show me exactly what math Martin's talking about, and that didn't show me the fingerprints of God in mathematics. And if I would have seen that as a kid, I would have been all in. And I think I remember mentioned last time my son Aiden, who's pretty gifted mathematically, he's now 24. A few years ago at my son's wedding, he came up to me and said, "Dad, can I talk to you?" I said, "At the wedding? Yeah. What? Like a serious talk. What's the matter, son?" He goes, "I think math is mysticism." I think you're right, son. So I wonder, hey, Martin, if you could read maybe a passage from the book.
Yeah, so maybe coming back to Teresa of Lisieux and this idea of the encounter with her, I would go to the opening of Movement 5, which somehow I find very poetic, and I have no idea how it even came about. And there it is. And so the interesting thing is Movement 5 starts in the following way. There's this bracket, and it says, she speaks, and then he replies. So she speaks. Every moment you ought to reflect on the greatest beauty you know. Not doing so is a lost opportunity. Turning to a lesser good is folly. If you love me, and I know you do, you devote every thought to me. You sanctify every instant of your life. You withhold nothing from me. You offer me your ideas and actions. You strive to please me in all you do. No one gives you greater beauty because I lead you to God. No one gives you greater joy because all purpose is from God. I teach you to love all people and to participate in the creation. I have been with you always, even when you knew me not. I smiled at you every morning. I watched over you every night. I listened to all your prayers and presented them to God. Loving me transports you beyond, helps you to overcome all worries, until you kneel before the Absolute in an infinite and everlasting peace. He replies, complete devotion to you was the dream of my youth, and this dream has grown with me over the years. Yeah, it's very hard for me to think actually about the race without having tears in my eyes. It always does this to me.
Mm.
I've got a question, little difficult to formulate, but again, if we're talking about math and kind of beauty, there's some like cultural critics, or it's let's say it's a theme underlying so many cultural critics and viewing or including Michael and I when Michael writes on like Ahriman versus Sophia. There's a certain way of seeing the mathematicization of everyday life, the mathematicization, the algorithmization of things as being uglification. When we talk about the beauty of math, an image of beauty which you so convincingly portray of this deep mathematics, it's the structure of the universe and is beautiful. And yet this association of the world we're actually building, we might see that its God, one of its gods, is a certain form of mathematics. Can you kind of unpack that for people in the way that you might voice, almost even let people know what you think I'm asking?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the experience of mathematicians is very surprising, sort of a great experience and sensation of beauty. So somebody who actually does math and experiences math and finds things in mathematics would always describe them as indescribably beautiful. So somehow you search for a solution and you don't have it yet, for example, but you already know that the solution will fulfill certain properties. And this will actually be a very beautiful and surprising connection between fields or something like this. So it is very surprising for me. And it's also mentioned in my book Beyond that mathematics is beautiful. And if we think that the greatest beauty that we know is also the good, the form of the good, and the good is the same as the beauty and is the same as God. And if it is true that the divine thought is mathematical, it is also true that the divine thought is the most beautiful thought, and therefore mathematics is beautiful.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe engineering, if we're looking at the world where so much of what we build is ugly. Everything, this planning, this obsession with planning, technicians kind of run the show. Would you call it a perversion of mathematics or a misapplication of the beauty of mathematics? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, not necessarily. Not necessarily. There is a danger. So there is a danger which is discussed within. If you are in this philosophical realm of Platonism, you kind of experience the Platonic realm as the reality, as the real thing. And you give not enough emphasis to the material world. So you might then live in a world where you say the material world is very passing and ugly, you could say. And the main character, Therese, in my book, she makes an argument against this. She says that's wrong. You shouldn't say it like this because, she says, every single moment of material existence has infinite meaning for God. There's infinite beauty in every single material instantiation, however small, however fleeting, because it's infinitely valuable to God. And that's an idea that I had actually in a church during a service. So she refers to the Athenian Academy and Plato and Aristotle standing there, and Plato is pointing to heaven and Aristotle is pointing to earth. And she says both of those views are correct because God really loves both the eternal and the temporal.
Mm-hmm. What I think, if I understood what Mike was saying about the misapplication of those things, so just like the misapplication of anything, and I think what you see, I mean, the way the devil works is through parody, or parody might be the wrong word, but they always call the devil the ape of God. So, there's a diabolical perversion of
Yeah.
the good, the true, and the beautiful. Is that what you're getting at, Mike?
Yeah, in one sense, a near miss, because like that Philip Sherrard, the translator of the Philokalia, he has essays that we would say, or when we talk, Martin, about the right brain and the left brain, the left brain is all, technocratic. We would say this hero, Wendell Berry, this great American kind of godfather figure. Are we building a world as if it's the kingdom of God, or a world as if it's a beehive, a world according to just mathematical soulless properties? It's that kind of distinction I'm kind of getting at, that people will use, the mathematical mind can be seen as this left brain, self-perpetuating, nested loops type of thing, something like that.
Well, like for instance, right, with the idea of what do they call it? Um, Not just digital currency, but using algorithms for surveillance and for control of people, right? So that's kind of a horrible application of this of mathematics, and computation, I should say. Probably computation is a better word than mathematics. Whereas what Martin is describing here, and it's very, this is why it's very sophiological. It's a revelation, right? It's and where you actually see the mind of God, or you have a revelation of the beautiful and the true and the good, in this world, and you see, and this is what I loved when I was teaching it back in the day. You see that not only is there order, but there's beauty to the order that is revealed through, and the thing is, it's revealed through nature, but it's not in nature. And that's beautiful. But as Mike was saying, and as I worry a lot about, you know, the imposition of calculation as a form of digital slavery. It's the potential is certainly there, and it's happening in China as we speak, right? Um, uh, and here's the thing: what's the antidote to that? And I would say part of the antidote is what Martin writes in this book.
Me too. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh,
Yes. We are in this world that is sort of not really ideal. So there's so much suffering in our world and in our society, and things are not really going in the right direction. And in within, she's a teacher, and she teaches Augustine.
Mhm.
Augustine for me is an amazing person because he gets it completely right. And he gets it completely right 1600 years ago. And if the world would have absorbed his message, which is just out there before our eyes, ignored, the world would be a very different place. Because Augustine nails every issue about life, about the purpose of life, about how to lead life. And we just don't do it. And this is something that moves me very much. And this is partly, I discuss this in Within, and I also want to discuss this in the forthcoming book. But in Within, she teaches to students Augustine. And for example, one thing that Augustine says is that a perfect relationship between people is mutual enjoyment in God.
Mhm.
So it is very clear that only God can make you happy. Only God can give you purpose. If you look to a partner, even in a marriage or so, or a friend, and you want to be happy because of that person, then you ask for something that only God can give you. But together you can find happiness if you together devote yourself to God. And that is true for all of society. So Augustine talks about the city of God and the city of the world. And this tension that you're describing is precisely this tension, the city of the world.
very good. Very good. Um, so and I like this idea of writing this as a form of prayer, right? Because I know from experience as a poet, but that and I think let me ask you. I'm going to ask you another question in a second here, but I know that in writing poetry, pardon me, there's you kind of spontaneously fall into a contemplative place. It's contemplation, and I was writing this week, and Mike and I have talked about this before. When I wrote my last book of poetry, mythologies of the wild of God, part of it, what I was doing was trying at first I was writing about I was making poetry from the stories that have lived in me since childhood, or young adulthood, like the stories of the Holy Grail and Dionysus, Orpheus, that have, stuck with me. And I was trying to examine those legends and myths from the perspective of the landscape around my farm. What would happen if Orpheus were here, or the head of Orpheus were found in the river down the road. But then I ran out of gas on that looking at those myths. I'm like, okay, I ran out of stories. What am I going to do now? And I just said, I'll let the landscape tell me stories. So I kind of put myself contemplatively into the landscape, and where I was stunned that the landscape started to tell me stories. Now they came through sounding like someone with my background who, you know, of Irish French Catholic background. So, living in Michigan in this particular time in history. But I was shocked, and pleasantly surprised that this landscape was telling me stories. And my question for you, Martin, was that a similar thing for you in getting into this contemplative frame of mind where, and it becomes a prayer, becomes a kind of prayer while you're doing this.
Yes, that's so. I have written on those topics also, just in this normal non-fiction style, where I just try to explain something, and I have many, many hundreds of pages unpublished manuscripts, and that is kind of the voice that I enjoy much less. And so, in contrast, here I'm sitting down, and I'm not writing it. I'm actually listening to it.
Mhm.
It is like you are sitting down to pray, but you are not saying anything because God speaks inside you.
Hmm.
I think this is this kind of prayer that is being described, contemplative prayer. And so then I do this very early in the morning, and all I try very hard is not to interfere with the process.
Hmm.
And then when it comes to sort of maybe 9 o'clock or so, I have to stop because then I'm too worried that I lose focus. And then I might accidentally interfere with what is going on there. I don't want to destroy it. So
Yeah, that's
my own
interesting.
work always as trying not to destroy it.
You try to get out of the way.
And so then there is a certain plot, and this plot is very important. And the plot, it never comes to me on my desk. So on my desk, it's never about the plot itself. The plot itself always happens to be when I'm away from my desk. When I'm, for example, sitting outside in the yard and looking at the sunset, and then suddenly there was this meeting that is described in Within between Therese of Lisieux and John of the Cross. So this idea that these two figures actually meet, uh, and that is in Movement 7. And for me, that's a very important encounter in that book. But
Yeah.
there is, of course, the idea for me, and the whole book is set in a library. The whole book is set in a library, and always we are asking this question: why a library? What is the meaning of this library, actually? And that is also part of the tension, which will be answered only in the very end. Um, but there is really this idea that every book, everything that is out there, ultimately is written by God. So therefore, it's not surprising that I have this impression, that I'm just listening.
Yeah. In fact, it's when J.R.R. Tolkien, when asked if Middle Earth was really a place, he said, "Of course it's a real place. I'm not making anything up. I'm basically taking dictation.
Mhm.
I'm just describing. I'm not making anything up." And I understand that. So I wonder if you could read a little bit of the conversation between Therese and Saint John of the Cross.
Oh, this one. So I should say in the very, very beginning of the book, so the book kind of follows up on Beyond, but Beyond has a very dramatic ending. So it is very unclear how after death, there can be a continuation. And so here for me, this is a kind of waking up in heaven. It's a waking up in heaven, similar to Goethe's Faust 2. The opening scene is a kind of waking up in heaven.
Yeah.
And actually, the dedication of the whole book is also that I attribute if there's anything good and of value in my book, I want to give it to Therese of Lisieux in the same way as she has given everything to God. So therefore, the book really opens with the dedication, how powerless I am to express in words the secrets of heaven. And that's a quote from Therese of Lisieux,
Mhm.
Mhm.
from one of her letters and also manuscript B. So this is how I start. So I think of her as the author. And then the opening chapter is that years after her death. So this is also very interesting because I don't know for what reason it starts like this. And
Mhm.
then I mean, Teresa of Lisieux died in 1897, so years after her death, I find it very interesting. Scholars found access to this library she has described. So there is this infinite library, and for the first time, scholars realize the existence of this library. It's a library of infinitely many books. That library is mentioned also in Beyond for no reason apparently, but now it becomes the underlying substance of within. And
Mhm.
and this is Borges' library also of infinitely many books, but in his library, all books are just possible. They're all combinatorial possibilities, so no books have meanings. In that library, we will discover every book she takes out from the shelf, it speaks to her. It has a message of love. So this is part of the mystery. But so the opening thing is then they discover this, and then there is a novice, the order finds access to the library, and the novice finds a room inside the library. And inside that room, he realized somebody had just been here and had read a book. And and then that book is open, and he starts to read that book, and he starts to read within that book. So there's several opening frames for within. But the interesting thing is that novice is named John of St. Matthias. And this is a little bit of a riddle for those who know. And recently I talked to a group of people, and there was a Carmelite nun there, and she knew what this meant.
Of course.
Because John of the Cross, before he met Teresa of Avila, he actually had the name John of St. Matthias, Juan de Mateo. And then after meeting Teresa of Avila, he changed his name to John of the Cross.
Hmm.
And so this is the opening figure. And therefore, and then the person is not mentioned. I mean, even though we often we hear quotes from John of the Cross there, but at the very end there, she then the main figure is in the library, but the librarian in the end asks her to leave because her mission is really going to go out into the world. And Therese always wanted to be a missionary. She's also the patron saint of
Patroness, yeah, of missions.
so therefore,
Paradox.
in movement 7, she then is out in the world. She is in this land where she doesn't even know where she is, and she walks along there, and she tries to find something, and it is evening, and it's getting cold, and she finds this shepherd's hut. So in the evening twilight, she found a shepherd's hut which stood alone under trees and appeared deserted. She observed it from afar, then walked around it twice. She wondered if it would do as a shelter for the night. So then she decides that because it is abandoned, she goes in there and she will spend the night there. But immediately she realizes there are actually 2 compartments in that shepherd's hut. Then in the middle of the night, she gets woken up and she's very worried because something is coming. And then there's sort of this moment of tension, like there's a robber or something. Somebody then enters that hut, but it is so dark that she doesn't see it. It is a dark night of the soul. It is a dark night of the senses. So these concepts of John of the Cross, they made no sense to me before meeting Therese of Lisieux. Therese of Lisieux's life is really lived what John of the Cross is talking about.
Hmm.
And so in this dark night, then she realizes somebody has entered the hut, and she takes all her courage together to start to speak to that person. And because she's alone there. And so after some hesitation, she elected to speak. Aiming for a calm voice, she uttered those words: "Whoever you are, wanderer of the night, may God bless you and protect your journey. You are finding a house at peace, but not empty." So this is also quoting John of the Cross, the house is at
Great
peace.
line. Yeah.
And then the visitor is also himself not a visitor, is like shocked to find somebody there and is speechless. And she speaks again. And then finally he says, she says to him, "Do not worry, my friend. Do not be distraught. I have come into this world to bring peace. I'm not here to judge, but I'm here to serve. May the peace of the Lord be with you." And now he replies, "And with your spirit," his reply came. And then a conversation between the 2 of them kind of unfolds. But a ray of moonlight hits this interior of the hut, and she asks him to stand into this ray of moonlight. And he obeys. So she now sees him, but he doesn't see her. And she then says, "What is your station in life, sir?" She asked him. "I am a weaver's son," he replied. "Your father is a weaver?" "My beloved mother is a weaver. My father has left this earthly exile long ago." "I'm very sorry to hear this," she said. "I was 3 years old when it happened. I have lost a brother too. Life has not been easy. I have a surviving brother whom I treasure on earth. I'm trying to be of use to him and to my mother. They are the greatest gifts God has given me." So this is John of the Cross. She doesn't yet realize it's John of the Cross, so she's silent and is thinking what to do with the situation. But then she asks him, well, there's this other compartment. Why don't you stay here? But he wants to continue to talk to her. And then it comes to her who he is. Then she realizes it's John of the Cross because she knows him from the infinite library that contains every book because she has read about him. And then she starts to speak to him. And in that moment, she gives him his greatest poetry. So his greatest poetry is revealed to him by the divine. And in that moment, in that hut. And I want to read actually one poem, not the most famous poem, but one poem that moves me immensely. And this is a poem by John of the Cross, which is then quoted here in slight modification. And one of his lesser known ones, but all of them are, of course, pinnacle of Spanish literature of poetry.
Yeah.
So it is a conversation between the Father and the Son. In the beginning was the Word, the Son. He lived in God. He knew in God infinite happiness. The Word was God, who in the beginning, who is the beginning. He was the beginning. He had no beginning. The Word is the Son, born of the beginning. The glory of the Father is the glory of the Son. As lover in the beloved, they live in each other. The love that unites them is one with them. The love is their equal, excellent as the one, splendid as the other, making three in one. One love among three, one love in them all, one lover, one beloved, boundless love unites them, for the three have one love, which is their essence. And now in that immense love, proceeding from the two, the Father spoke words of profound affection and deep delight, which were meant for the Son. My Son, only your company contents me. Whatever pleases me, I love that thing in you. Whoever resembles you most satisfies me most. Whoever is like you in nothing will find nothing in me. So for me, this kind of summarizes all. Whoever is like Christ in nothing will find nothing in me. So this and not further is where God's judgment goes. So the soul who does not resemble Christ in anything, maybe that's not even possible, will find nothing in God.
And you say, because you emphasize the complementary to that a lot beautifully, which is that when you fall in love or when there's love, you live in another and another lives in you. You know,
Yes, and again,
yeah, it's
that's
the same thing. They're like that.
yes, that's John of the Cross
Yeah.
again.
And then to conceive of the Trinity, people can start to get at that through the feeling of romantic love. That's the power of Dante. And then the fact that in the Trinity, it breaks free from that dyad and can theoretically, and when I trace the history of mysticism like shorthand, and I think I've mentioned this once, you could say that, that you have Dante, that when he falls in love, perfection walks the streets of Florence and he knows not even her name, right? It's the divine, it's not conquest. And then Thomas Traherne, I think, advances that when he says, like, when I fall in love, it's not that I love that one too much, but I love other people too little. We start to get after the incarnation, it becomes a little more personal. And my sense, if there's a significance to Thomas Merton, is that famous vision he had on the corner of 4th and Walnut, where what you essentially get is not a crowd. He didn't fall in love with people in the abstract, but he fell in love with everybody in a consumerist part of Louisville. He could rescue people from the crowd into community. His love was that for them as individuals, and that's we're getting very close to the kingdom of God right then, if we're bringing it in, but this, and your books for me, are playing with these themes so powerfully, so powerfully.
Very much. And I wonder actually what's occurring to me, and actually the reason being is it's something I've been thinking a lot about lately. The relationship to dream, mysticism, and poetic creation. The way all of them work with image to a certain degree, and all of them work with words to a degree. But the thing is, like you asked me, what was Therese wearing, and I can't remember. But my question is, and this is what I've really been thinking, talking about my story about writing these poems and hearing your discussion of the infinite library and thinking about Tolkien, And the question that's been living with me lately is, okay, so and like Tolkien said, of course it's a real place. And I know these poems I was writing, of course it's a real place. And I know with both of your books, of course it's a real place. But my question is, it's a real place. Did we discover it? Did we participate in birthing it? Does it continue to exist after we discover it or we articulate it? And how does that, I mean, if at all, fit in with the idea of the infinite library?
I
Yeah, I
like the
think
question.
that the infinite library, so the mystery permeates the book, but I can tell you without spoiling it completely, I can tell you it very much has to do with the soul. Because this is what I find astonishing. We are walking through life, and every single moment when I'm walking in my garden or so, and I'm looking at something, and there is kind of meaning. So the things, events, or images, they mean something to us. There's a tree that is giving sap in spring, or spring is coming, or we see birds and animal. There's meaning. And where does meaning come from? So meaning itself is not somehow the material. It's more like this immaterial. It's more like this eternal. So in every moment, I'm arguing, we are connecting the material world and the immaterial, unchanging world, the timeless and the temporal. And this is what the library does. This is what is inside the soul. And Leibniz actually describes the soul as a monad, and he says the
Right.
entire information of the universe is present in every single soul. And that makes complete sense to me.
Hmm.
There is
Hmm.
so in some sense, if I ask you, who is Michael Salter, who is Michael Martin, to really answer that question, I have to basically answer everything I know about the universe because that
Hmm.
made a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's like the idea of David Bohm's idea of implicate order, right? That the whole is implied in the part, and the part is implied in the whole, which that's pure sophiology. That goes actually, it's not just David Bohm, it's Jakob Boehme. This is that kind of, and it's the thing is, it's an insight, um, and it's so, and this is why glad Mike mentioned Thomas Traherne earlier because it's all over the place in Thomas Traherne's
It's
poetry
everywhere. Yeah.
because it's the vision we have of the world as children. We know, you know it intuitively as a child. And as Traherne argues, then your education beats it out of you. You're bred out of it. Just like, in graduate school, usually English majors are bred out of their love for literature.
So if we lose that vision, though, my sense is the great poetry, and we know Martin. Um, I remember you mentioning Mahler last time, and you're a lover of classical music. So I never want to be caught or pretend that I'm reducing classical music, but like this paradigm, which is as a schematic, can capture a lot. Michael's talking about that original wholeness. We see nature as it is. Blake kind of, intimates that. Well, no, I mean, he saw it exactly. Then we kind of fall away. There's this alienation, as Owen Barfield talks about. And then there's the final participation where we see nature again as we did as infants, but with a difference. So first, like to Michael Martin, how do you describe the difference? Is that an okay question? Because I wonder if Martin can see it from the mathematical order and things
Well,
like that.
the difference between how you see it as a child and if you come to it as an adult.
Yeah, or what like Ricoeur would say is the higher naivete,
Well,
the higher innocence, the um
it's well, I
the
think
return with a difference. Yeah,
it's the hymn of the pearl. It's Sophia in exile.
yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
we we forget why we were sent here by our Father. That's the hymn of the pearl, right? And Martin mentioned suffering, which is a big theme in John of the Cross and Trees of Lycia, right? Which, in a way, I was thinking about this. George Herbert has, I think, 5 poems in the Temple called Affliction. And his meditation on affliction is something that calls us back to God, not as a punishment but for some strange reason, we we discern not in affliction, but we discern that there's something other. I mean, Trace. Therese died at 24.
I mean, so this is a very big part of the greatness and sanctity of Therese of Lisieux is her unbelievable suffering. And so the suffering was not only that she died at the age of 24, she very slowly suffocated. She suffocated over a period of 1.5 years. Slowly her lungs sort of were filled just by tuberculosis. And in the end, she had only a little bit of a lung left. And the strange thing is, she knew instinctively, and you can see this in her letters and in her comments, she knew that this suffering had something to do with the way how people will ultimately respond to her.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a mystery to me, but this is a truth. But in addition to this physical suffering, and we can talk more about that, she entered this tunnel of darkness. So on Easter 1896, she lost this spiritual consolation. She lost somehow a faith in heaven. In the canonization process, much was discussed about that, and ultimately it was described as a temptation against hope. She always talks about loving God. Her love was always there for God, but somehow she did not see heaven anymore as a possibility the way how she saw it as a child. And this was terrible for her. But this is so she entered this tunnel of darkness and she never came out of it before her death. So as far as we know, she never came out of it. And this is what John of Cross really calls the dark night of the spirit, because he says, at first there is the dark night of the senses. So then, in some sense, the senses bring us all these things from the material world to us as beautiful things, but also as confusion sometimes. This is what we were talking about before. And maybe God, in His grace, at some stage will decide to bring us into a night of the senses, where these senses suddenly don't mean to me the same anymore. At the same time, so I'm not confused anymore by the material world. I'm focusing on the beauty of God. And then I'm experiencing this great spiritual consolation. And this is the transition from somehow a beginner to somebody who is a little bit proficient. So this is really the initiation of a spiritual life, one could say. And maybe this is already a great blessing. And this is maybe the only thing that I've ever experienced myself. But the next thing is, and now God comes and takes away the spiritual consolation. And this is the transition from proficient to saint. And this is described by Teresa of Lisieux, this lived by Teresa of Lisieux. And I'm even frightened by that. So now
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
sweetness is gone, and I could not possibly live without that.
Yeah, you see it also in John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, right? Which is, I mean, sometimes I don't know what to do with that depth of spiritual psychology.
Right.
Because it's like it's a little terrifying, right?
So the other thing that the suffering of Teresa, I've thought a lot about it. It makes her really a female Christ-like figure of our
Yeah.
own historical sort of just 100 years ago.
That's what you were doing in your book. That's what you were doing in your book because you let them merge. And
Yes.
I think you said something new about Jesus and you said something new about the little flower, because I think your brain was a very fertile for the to the great blessing of the readers. Your brain was very fertile in that area, and that's what makes those lines come alive. Yeah.
I mean, she died on 30th September 1897. She makes several times, she makes a statement. It's unbelievable how great this suffering is. If anybody would have told me how difficult it is to separate the soul from the body, I just would not have believed it. When will this finally end? And then there's this very moving scene at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is the holy hour, also mentioned here, of course. She suddenly can't breathe anymore. She cannot breathe anymore. And then her sisters come and they elevate her arms. She has both arms outstretched, right and left. And the sisters lift up these arms and she tries to breathe a little bit. And the death on the cross is a death by suffocation.
Yeah.
And so her own Calvary continued because she died at 7 o'clock in the evening.
Hmm.
Martin, I don't mean this to be a hard detour on it, but we're talking about some pretty rich stuff there. And I don't want this to fall into just a simple science and religion thing. but in a different way, like, and even at this time, some of our listeners are thinking, Professor Michael Nowak from Harvard University walks out of his office, and at least maybe it's the media, but we got to believe that 90% of your colleagues think you're like totally effing nuts, right? Is that is that an exaggeration of the climate, or what is your experience in that, you know?
So the strange thing is that sort of, for example, one of my graduate students, who is a complete mathematical genius,
Uh-huh.
is one of the most devout Catholics I have ever
Sure,
met,
sure.
and a complete saint.
Mhm.
And I'm constantly surrounded by those people. So
Oh, good.
You find enough sustenance, yeah.
even when I mention things like this in my class, when I try to talk them about worldview, about philosophical issues, I find like they are receptive. The students are actually hungry for this.
Mhm.
It's not so easy always to raise the subject.
Do you
But
think a college education, by and large, though, hurts that poetic, that religious instinct? You know, are they fortunate to come to you with those instincts still alive, or have we let education go too far in the other direction that those natural instincts are almost squashed out?
I think education is in a problem. We're in a problematic space.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think Harvard has forgotten its mission. The word of Harvard is veritas.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Veritas means divine truth.
Mhm.
And originally it was only there for the education of clergy.
Mm.
I think they have become too intimidated by the demands of the material world.
Mhm.
And not only Harvard, but every university. And I think we are too much teaching knowledge, but not wisdom. So at the university, they try to indoctrinate you with knowledge, but not with wisdom. And then there's also this fearful preparation for a life in a very competitive society. And will I make it? Will I get a job? So there's more fear that I see sometimes in the students about their future, rather than joy about what they could learn about how beautiful the world actually is. I think our society at large is suffering because we have lost focus of God, and only the focus of God can actually save us.
Well, I'm glad I asked. You know, again, because you're probably too often cast in the role of, hey, can you give us a science versus religion debate? When really you're kind of a poet and you have this other calling from she, the divine she. Um, I was wondering if you're ever struck. Michael has mentioned this, I think, on the podcast. It's just a small instance in the history of religion, but you know, this mystical fact that the Song of Songs in the Bible, you know, could be seen as the most mystical book in all of literature and so forth. And the word God is not named, right? There's a very strong presence of the divine feminine. Even the phrase, she is black and comely, there's a mathematical principle there of just, you know, the period in the sentence, the yod, there's all this poetry. How does that paradoxical reality that in the Song of Songs, the name of God isn't even named? Does that sound like a mathematical truth to you? It's a poetic truth.
I don't know, but so in this scene, she quotes, she sings
Yeah,
to John of the Cross, the Canticle of Love. So the Canticle of Love by John of the Cross is similar to that. And there
yeah.
is this beautiful love story between the stag and the dove, between Jesus and the bride, between God and the bride.
Mhm.
And also this is presented then in this scene in Movement 5, where I find this interaction very beautiful, and maybe I can describe it by mentioning this painting by Raphael Soya, The Annunciation.
Okay.
The Annunciation shows two women, and they are women who are apparently in the process of washing clothes, or at least one of them is washing clothes. But then it's the Annunciation, and so if you realize it's the Annunciation, you realize one of the women is an angel. So the other woman is Mary. She has her hands like this, and she has this piece of clothes that she has just been washing. And the angel is dressed in like purple and in black to signify royalty and suffering of what is about to happening. And the angel is shifting weight from one foot to the other foot. And the whole room is leaning toward Mary, and Mary is looking down. And you realize it is the moment where the question has been asked. The question was just asked.
Mhm.
And the whole world and God is waiting for her answer. And I find this an unbelievable interaction. So God asks Mary, but her consent has to be given. And for me, this is the divine feminine in a sense.
Mm.
God asks you, And then she answers, I will be your bride. I have agreed to be your bride.
Mhm. There's something really, and I can't help but mention it. There's something really poetic about this podcast with you here today talking about this, because there's something poetic about the paradox that you're discussing with the current politics going on, right? All of our attention could be exterior at this point. And yet, mathematically, I believe, maybe in the principle of like harmonic convergence, that at the center, one of the things we need to be doing spiritually right now is anchoring people in the present moment in the center, with the reality of this, the truth of divine love. Because if we're only hanging out in the peripheries, with the latest, everybody can agree right now, we're getting assaulted. There's a lot turning over. That, sure, not saying we can't follow the news even daily and so forth. Hopefully we have a sense of humor about it, but it's like a bubbling cauldron. Things are being born and things are coming down. But beyond that, I feel a presence with, the theme of this podcast where the divine feminine is so present. It's the counterpoint. It's one of the things we can do to calm the world. It's necessary. We can pray for these current events like dominoes, but we're not in control. The most control we have is centering ourselves as individuals, coffee with a friend, asking other people how they're doing, things like that. Michael?
I mean, no, I was just thinking couple minutes ago, how opportune it is to have this conversation with Martin during the first week of Lent.
Yeah, right. That's
No?
the same poetry. I was going to say the
Yeah.
same thing.
Yeah, which
Also
is
the International Day of Women, by the way, today.
Wow.
Oh,
wow,
today
wow.
I didn't know.
Yeah, like thy will be done at the beginning of Lent. We can say it any day. It's right there, any moment. The now is fine. Thy will be done, not mine.
And I think you may or may not know this, but we're coming up on the Feast of the Annunciation in a couple weeks, which prior to modern times was not only the Feast of the Annunciation, it was the day the calendar year changed. And it was also understood to be the last day of creation and the historical day of the crucifixion. It was the most important day of the year, which is why all those things change. Which is that's what a poetic metaphysics is, right? Um, and to and the thing is, we don't. I mean, our culture does not, as Martin was just saying, so certainly, my experience teaching college for the last 25 years suggests that we teach information but not wisdom. And I think this coincides not just with a decline in the teaching of theology or talking about even comparative religion, but it's another thing that associates it is the decline of our relationship in an educational setting to literature and poetry. So because people are not they lose the faculty. It's like losing, it's like having atrophy in an organ. If you don't have the organ, if you don't use your eyes, they disappear.
I
Like
used to
you
tell
see in
confirmation
Salamander
students that
and
we're given the
Cave.
gifts of the Holy Spirit. If we don't use them, they atrophy and they die. Yeah.
What? And that's what I love Goethe saying about light. Light creates the eye,
Mhm.
you know, which is an interesting way to look at things. Um, but without having even a training, I don't know what to call it exactly, but an immersion in a kind of poetic metaphysics, all you're left with is materialism. And I'm glad you mentioned Goethe earlier, and I couldn't help when actually I wrote my endorsement for your book. I mentioned Goethe because I see in what you do a very, very similar thing to what Goethe did, trying to bring together the worlds of poetic intuition and science,
And you're a Middle European
over 200
yourself, which
years
I
ago.
find relevant.
So
I do.
Goethe,
He's a Middle European.
yeah, so it's a
You think
huge
differently than a
influence.
Westerner. Yeah.
Huge influence for me. So I
Yeah.
was like, as a teenager, fascinated by the sufferings of young Werther, and I read other books related to it, and also Thomas Mann, Lotte in Weimar. So that meant a lot to me. Faust means a lot means a lot
Yeah.
to me. I know parts of Faust actually by heart. I was always
Uh,
fascinated by the fact that Goethe was totally motivated by describing the feminine, the beautiful. But somehow I always
Mhm.
felt he never really describes those figures. I mean, it is just taken for granted that they are loved, and then Werther loves Lotte. But what do we actually learn about Lotte? That is amazing. So I wanted in my books to write something more about those female figures that are actually being admired so much.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I do love that in Faust in particular, how the the divine feminine moves through different characters. First it's in Gretchen, then it goes to Helen, and then toward the end you get to the Mater Gloriosa,
Mm.
right? Which is just the whole movement is extraordinary, and the end of Faust Part Two is I get
Das
chills
ewig
just thinking
Weibliche
about it.
zieht uns hinan, das ewig Weibliche zieht uns hinan, the eternal female draws us heavenward.
That's right,
Mhm.
So this is also something that always moved me, and this is what I want to describe in those books. So this is
and you are.
Yeah, no, you
So we're running about out of time. So before we finish, could you read us one more passage from the book?
One more, yes, that's right. So the one passage that I want is we mentioned about it before, and this is also something which was very influential in forming even the book. So in Christianity, we are asked to love our enemies, which is kind of strange. And it may be not clearly present in other religions, as much emphasis as in Christianity. So, how do you actually love your enemies? And that wasn't clear to me before reading Teresa of Avila, actually. Then reading Teresa of Avila, I realized it is so clear to her that God loves her so much that everything that happens in her life is deliberately allowed by God to bring nourishment to her soul. And if there are people who cause problems for her, it is still allowed by God because ultimately it's good for her. And she has to pray for them that if they make mistakes, maybe they should find back to God. So this for me was an important realization. And in the end of the book, so she is in this infinite library, and in this infinite library, there was this encounter of a librarian, and they have this conversation, and together they read Thérèse of Lisieux. So this whole movement, 6 is about Thérèse of Lisieux. But then in movement 7, he asks her actually, the librarian asks her, love your enemies. 3 times he asks her, and 3 different answers she gives. And this is for me a little bit the 3 times when Jesus asks Peter at the shores of the lake, "Do you love me?" So
Mhm.
it's just one page that I want to read you, but I want to read these 3 answers. Love your enemies, the librarian said. Good father, I have no enemies, she replied. If there are people who harm me, who destroy what I have gathered, I do not see them as my enemies. They act under confusion. They are not filled by love. Evidently, they do not know what they are doing. If they were aware of light, they would not hurt me. Since they walk in darkness, I want to help them. I pray that God may restore them to their love. I show them my love so they can be healed. As we have read, where there is no love, you must give love, and you will draw love. That's John of the Cross. This last thing is John of the Cross.
powerful.
Then second, love your enemies, the librarian said. Good father, I have no enemies, she replied. Those that hurt my body do not reach my inner self, because I alone am the guardian of my soul. They break a shell, they burn a house, destroy my work, but I'm only my soul, which they cannot touch. Hurting me, they harm their own soul. I pray for them. Nothing evil can happen to a good person. That is Socrates. But the last answer, love your enemies, the librarian said. Good father, I have no enemies, she replied. Everything that confronts me is willed by God. On my knees, I thank the Lord for his graces each day. If people trespass against my material instantiation, they are permitted by God to bring food for my soul. If God deigns that I receive injustice before the world, my heart rejoices because the Lord permits me to grow. In those instances, I'm especially blessed before people, and the love for the Lord consumes me fervently. Praise and glory belong to God alone. The soul cannot grow on those foods, but humiliation makes the soul rejoice and rise toward the door of heaven. All I have is from God and goes back to God. My only desire is to make God loved on earth. That's Teresa of Lisieux. My desire is to kindle love in the hearts of all people, help those who are in pain, feed those who are hungry. My food is love. I am love. It is love that moves me. In the edifice of the church, my mother, I am love. God does not, that's Teresa of Lisieux, of course. God does not need me while I devote my life to him. Many others can take my role and be better servants. I'm a grain of sand, but I do know that he loves me. I give myself to his love, and in him alone I trust. He allows me to console him. He permits me to bring souls to him. He asks me to be bold before him. He has loved me from the beginning of time, and I have promised to be his bride. He grants that my will be done in heaven as I have never done my will on earth.
Mm,
This is a
very
famous quote of Teresa of Lisieux.
No, I'd never heard that.
beautiful. Ah, it was a beautiful conversation. So, Martin,
Really.
thank you so much for joining us today. And
Welcome.
actually, this is really helpful for me too. This is a very nourishing and helpful thing for me to hear going into Lent as we are.
Yeah, yeah. That's what I was thinking too when you said that, Michael. A wonderful way to go into Lent. Very, very open, very earthy and spiritual at the same time. You're a fascinating character. You wrote and wondered if we wanted to talk to you, and like that's a real honor to be asked. And the conversation was worth every minute.
Thank
Absolutely.
you so much. Thank
Yeah.
you for the friendship.
Thanks everybody for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. We'll see you when we see you next time because we're